This past week, we read about China, India, and the Israelites coming into the land of Canaan. We don't have a lot of written records about early China or about early India, and there are very few written records about the 7 tribes that were already living in Canaan when the Israelites came in. In the case of China, they actually kept a lot of written records, but much of the early history was burned during the Qin dynasty. A politician who worked for the Qin emperor Shi Huangdi decided to burn all of the books from the previous dynasties because he was tired of hearing scholars criticize the current government for not being more like the traditional rulers of the past. Unfortunately, because the records were burned, the Chinese lost much of their history. This past week, we read about the Xia dynasty and the Shang dynasty. And as you look at the map, you'll notice that both the Xia and the Shang dynasty grew up around the Yellow River. According to tradition, before the Xia dynasty, the first rulers of China were called the 3 sovereigns and the 5 emperors. The 3 sovereigns were the heavenly sovereign, the earthly sovereign, and the human sovereign. And they had godlike powers and are credited with creating humanity. The first of the 3 sovereigns was Fu Qi. Fu Qi was credited with creating marriage, with creating the art of hunting and net fishing, and instituting sacrifices to heaven. The second of the 3 sovereigns was Nuwa. He was credited with creating the 4 earthly directions, north, south, east, and west. And you may have heard that the Chinese believe that the earth was sitting on the back of a turtle, and it is Nuwa who is credited with doing that, placing the earth on the back of that turtle. The third of the 3 sovereigns, Shennong, whose name means God Farmer, was credited with creating farming and farming tools, and they say that he experimented with different herbs to be used for medicine. He also created markets and bartering so that people could trade their farm goods. Because each of the 3 sovereigns was considered to be full of heavenly virtue, each of them lived to be very old and ruled over a period of great peace in China's history. Remember that they believed that this happened at the beginning of creation. After the 3 sovereigns came the 5 emperors. The 5 emperors ruled until the beginning of the Xia dynasty, and the first of the 5 emperors was the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi. According to tradition, at the end of Shenyong's dynasty, the different dukes within China began to rise up in rebellion against him, and there was chaos. And Huangdi is credited with quelling that chaos and bringing back peace to China. According to tradition, he was the first one to use weapons of war to subdue the rebels. And after many battles, he was able to bring China under his rule and bring peace back to China. Xuanxu was the Yellow Emperor's grandson, and he was remembered for being a man of great learning and also of great peace. He supposedly recorded the seasons and the movements of the heavenly bodies, and he was able to expand his rule further into the 4 directions, north, south, east, and west. When Xuanxu died, his cousin's son, Ku, became emperor. According to tradition, Ku was born a genius, but he was a very humble man, and he was also very thrifty. He was very respected by the people. He's credited with making the first calendar. When Ku died, his son Qi initially became emperor, but he was said to have reigned very poorly, and he died soon after becoming emperor, and his brother Yao became emperor in his place. Yao was famous for being meritorious and benevolent to the people, and he's remembered for bringing harmony to what the Confucianists called the 9 degrees of kin. In other words, he brought peace and harmony to his whole extended family. Yao is also remembered for choosing officials based on their merit rather than on their position of power or who their family was. Because of his commitment to placing the best people into positions of power, Yao didn't want his son to be the emperor after him. Instead, he chose a distant cousin of his who was known for his merit and for his piety. This cousin was named Shun. According to tradition, Yao gave Shun 2 of his daughters to be his wives, and then he watched how Shun treated the 2 wives. Shun was able to pass this test. He treated them both equally and fairly. And so Yao came up with other tests, and one by one Shun was able to pass these tests, and he was chosen to succeed Yao as the next emperor of China. Like Yao, Shun valued merit over birth, and he considered his own son too worthless to become the new emperor. Instead, Shun chose one of his ministers, a man named Yu, to be his successor. And Yu, later known as Yu the Great, became the first emperor of the Xia dynasty that we read about this past week. Yu had made a name for himself by building canals to help control the flooding that plagued the cities along the Yellow River. Yu's reign lasted for about 45 years, and when he died, rather than choosing the most meritorious person as his 2 predecessors had done, he decided to choose his son to succeed him as emperor, and thus the dynasty of the Xia was established and continued. Remember that a dynasty is a series of members of the same ruling family taking control of the government from one generation to the next. The descendants of Yu the Great actually ended up ruling for almost 500 years. During the time of the Xia, the peasants celebrated what was called the Spring Festival. The Spring Festival was a time to worship the gods of agriculture because they wanted their crops to grow. They also wanted their friends and families to grow. So each year, several villages would gather together for the festival. And during the festival, young boys and young girls would meet for the first time, and they would find husbands and wives for themselves. In general, girls got married around age 15, and boys also got married around age 15, or maybe a little bit older. I wanted to share with you a traditional folk tale that dates from the time of the Xia. I just thought that it was interesting. And it says, once upon a time, a long time ago, there was a young, wise woman named Lao Nu. She was very young to be the village wise woman. Still, the people in the village trusted her. If you had a problem, everyone knew that you took it to Lao Nu. One day, the sky overhead darkened. The wind picked up and blew wildly. Several young children ran up the hill to Lao Nu's home, dragging a basket behind them. The basket was overflowing with the remains of blue flowers that had been yanked by the wind from the earth. "The sky has fallen," they screamed to Lao Nu. "The sky has fallen." The children knew this was a very bad time for this to happen. Their village had been selected by many others to host this year's spring festival. It was quite an honor. The village would be disgraced without a sky. The children were too young to find husbands and wives at the festival, but their older sisters and brothers had been talking of nothing else. Lao Nu sent the children back down the hill to search for all the pieces of the sky. They tried their best, but the children were worried. The wind had blown everything everywhere. What if they had missed some pieces? The next day, the children ran outside. With great relief, they looked up at a bright blue sky. And that night, when they looked up at the sky, they couldn't believe their eyes. The sky had always been dark at night. Lao Nu had patched the sky with bright twinkling lights just in time for the spring festival. The Xia came into power around 2000 BC. As I mentioned, there aren't a lot of written records left behind by them, but there are some archaeological records. According to archaeologists, cities that date from the time of the Xia are characterized by what we call rammed earth building techniques. Rammed earth is a building technique similar to adobe that was used in the western United States, where you take sandy earth and you ram it as hard as you can together until it forms a solid stone-like structure. According to archaeologists, the Xia would make a rammed earth floor for their buildings, and then they would use what are called post beams, where they would put large posts at strategic locations around the foundation, and then they were able to use lighter material to go in between these big heavy posts. So that's called a post beam framework. And so they found public buildings, temples, and even palaces made with this post beam and rammed earth construction method. From what the Xia left behind, they can tell that they did live in settled communities and that there was probably a social hierarchy and specialization. Craftsmen, farmers, artists, a standing army, and a political class. Around 1600 BC, the Xia were defeated by the Shang. We have a little bit more written record from the Shang than we do from the Xia. For example, we know that the Shang had a calendar and that it was based on the lunar cycle, and that the Shang kept records of taxation, tribute money, and divination. They used oracle bones. Oracle bones are actually pretty interesting. According to the research that I did, oracle bones were the flat parts of bones from different animals or the backs of turtle shells. And what they would do is they would write questions that they wanted either the gods or the ancestors to answer. Then they would either burn the bones or they would use tools to puncture the bones. And based on the cracks that were left behind, they would divine or figure out what the answer to the question was. They asked all different kinds of questions. For example, they would ask for the most auspicious day to perform a wedding, or they might ask if now was the time to send out the army. They might ask for the best time to plant this year, or they might ask if they should allow the surgeon to operate on their sore tooth. They might ask all sorts of things. And so what they would do is they would, on the oracle bone, they would record what the question was. Then after examining the cracks that were left behind from either burning or puncturing the bone, they would write down what the person deciphering the cracks in the bone predicted the answer was from either the gods or from the ancestors. The interesting thing is that in addition to writing down the question that they had asked and what they thought the answer was, they would also come back and weeks later, months later, years later, they would write down what actually the result was. This was the question, this was the answer that we got, and as a result, this is what happened. And so these oracle bones ended up being a treasure trove when archaeologists found them, because it gave them an insight into not only the kinds of questions that were being asked at the time, but also there was a history of what actually happened, what the result was. And according, like I said, to the research that I did, that apparently they would kind of average out the answers. For example, they might ask the same question 5 times in a row, and if they got 3 positive answers, yes, go ahead and get married on this day, it will be auspicious, and then they might have gotten 2 negative answers, they would take the average. All right, we got a positive response more often than we got a negative response, and so let's go ahead and go with the positive response. And then of course then later on they would come back and tell you this marriage never worked out, or this marriage ended up being wonderful, this was an auspicious day to have the marriage, and everything went well with them. On these oracle bones we have the first example of Chinese writing. In addition to oracle bones dating from the Shang Dynasty, archaeologists have also found very sophisticated bronze works and ceramics, and even little trinkets made from jade. By 1200 BC, the Shang armies were equipped with horse-drawn chariots and also with bronze-tipped spears. Within the Shang culture, the king functioned as the head of state, but also he functioned as the priest for the people. He would lead the people in worship of Shang-Ti, the Emperor of Heaven. And because these early Chinese worshipped Shang-Ti, or the Emperor of Heaven, many historians believe that the original Chinese were actually monotheists. Shang-Ti had no idol made for him, and twice a year the Emperor of China would lead the people in a sacrifice of oxen and sheep to Shang-Ti, called the border sacrifice. In fact, the border sacrifice continued in China until 1911, and so it went on for thousands of years each year. We know that by the end of the Shang dynasty, that the Chinese were not just worshipping Shang-Ti, but they were also trying to communicate and worship their ancestors. And it was the wishes of the ancestors and the wishes of the gods that they were consulting when they used the oracle bones. Before we move on to India, I did want to talk a little bit about Chinese characters. The information that I have in the next few slides actually comes from Pastor K.T. Kang, who was a native of China and a devout Christian. One day he noticed that the Chinese character for boat was made up of smaller parts. We call the smaller parts radicals. There was a radical that stood for a vessel and the number 8, and then also a radical for mouth or person. And as he looked at the Chinese character for vessel, he began to think about how Noah's Ark was a vessel that held 8 mouths or 8 people. And so Pastor Kang began to look for other evidences in early Chinese characters that showed that the Chinese people understood the creation story as found in the Bible. And he found many examples that showed that, yes, they did understand the creation story. For example, the Chinese character for create is made up of several interesting radicals. For example, in the character create, we have the radical for dust or mud, and we have the radical for mouth or person. And so we have a dust person who is brought to life. And they're not a baby brought to life. They're an adult. They get up and they walk. And so for creation, we have a dust man who is brought to life and is walking. The Chinese character for garden shows 4 rivers flowing from the center of the garden. And we see that in the book of Genesis, the Garden of Eden is described as having 4 rivers flowing out of it. The Chinese character for first shows a dust man who lives. And so the first man was made from dust, and the breath of life was blown into him, and he lived. The Chinese character for fire or for light show a person who seems to be glowing. And Pastor Kang thought perhaps man's original appearance was shining and glowing, similar to how Moses, when he was in God's presence, began to shine and to glow. He reasoned that perhaps man, when he was in the garden and fellowshiped with God face to face daily, that he glowed with the light of God. The Chinese character for ancestor is made up of the radicals of God and also. And so Pastor Kang reasoned that Adam was created in God's image. And the Chinese character for important or necessary is made up of the radicals of first and man. The first man was in an enclosure. He was in a garden. And late in the day, he realized that he desired a helpmate. The helpmate that he was given, of course, was a woman. And so the first man in the garden needed a woman. She was important. She was necessary. We're going to move on now from China to India. And just like the Xia and the Shang civilizations grew up around a river, so did the Harappan civilization. It grew up around a river, specifically the Indus River. Remember from your reading that the main cities were Harappa to the north and Mohenjo-daro to the south. Like the Chinese civilizations, primarily what we know about the early Indian civilization comes from archaeological finds. Now, like the Chinese, they did have a written language. Unfortunately, not enough inscriptions have been found for archaeologists and historians to be able to translate, and so it remains a mystery. We don't know what history those inscriptions hold. We primarily do know that their cities were very complex and they were very well built. They had sewage systems, they had advanced architecture, they got water from wells, they built granaries, and they even built dockyards. The dockyards are evidence that they were trading up and down the river, as well as along the coast. The Harappan civilization has evidence that they worked in bronze and copper and tin, as well as in gold and silver. Unfortunately, we just don't know a whole lot beyond that. I wanted to show you this statue that was found by archaeologists, and they labeled him as the priest king. And I wanted you to think about what we talked about when we are working with artifacts. Sometimes we can observe things and sometimes we infer things. And so I just wanted you to think about the name priest king here. Is that an observation or is that an inference? We're going to move on to discussing the 7 Canaanite tribes that were in what we call the Promised Land when the Israelites were headed into the Promised Land. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information about those 7 tribes either. Primarily what we know about them come from cuneiform tablets that have been found in the cities of Mari and Ebla. And then also we know a little bit about those 7 tribes because of Egyptian records. We're going to start by discussing the Hittites. According to Genesis chapter 10, the Hittites were the descendants of Heth, who was a son of Canaan, who was the son of Ham, who was the son of Noah. And so Heth would have been a great-grandson of Noah. According to archaeology, the Hittites actually had a kingdom that was located in what we now call Turkey. The area would have been north and west of the land of Canaan. They actually had a thriving civilization in that area, and at one point they were overwhelmed and overcome by invaders. And so by the time the Israelites were headed into the land of Canaan, the Hittites had moved down through Canaan to the south of Canaan. So they were located on the southernmost edge of what we call the Promised Land. You can see from these artifacts from the time that they were actually living north and west of the Promised Land that they had a fairly advanced civilization. They equipped their warriors with uniforms, so they probably had a standing army, and they were best known for being very good hunters. And so you see there's an artifact here that honors the hunters of the Hittites. Notice also that it seems like that they had curly hair. I think that that's an interesting observation about them. The Perizzites were further west than the Hittites, and primarily what we know about them comes from their interactions with the Egyptians. This is actually an Egyptian relief showing Perizzite prisoners of war. The thing that they are primarily remembered for is that the Perizzites lived in unwalled cities. Interesting. North of the Hittites and the Perizzites were the Jebusites. They were remembered for being very warlike, and they are the ones who held the city of Jerusalem, and the Israelites were not able to conquer the city of Jerusalem. It wasn't until the time of David that Israel conquered Jerusalem, and I think that was like 400 years later. The Amorites are remembered for being very tall. In fact, they may have been the ones that the Israelite spies came back and said, "We saw giants in the land," because the Amorites were famous for their height. We know some things about the Amorites because the people who lived in the city of Ur, the Sumerians, wrote about Amorite raids on their cities. In fact, the Sumerian king Shulgi, I don't know if you remember us talking about him several weeks ago, but he was so upset by these Amorite nomads regularly coming in and raiding his towns that he built a 155-mile wall to keep the Amorites out of Sumer. Unfortunately, he did not have the resources to properly man the wall, and the wall eventually came to an end, and so the Amorites simply walked around the wall and continued to raid his cities. The tribe that was actually named the Canaanites were remembered for being the most evil of all the 7 tribes that lived in the land of Canaan. They were worshippers of Baal and of El and of Anat and Asherah, and when they practiced their religious services, they regularly practiced child sacrifice to these different gods, and that was considered to be very gross and very inhumane. The Canaanites had fortified cities. In other words, they had walls around their cities. They had temples and houses and public buildings and shops. And their cities were surrounded and supported by farmland and small villages that grew olives and grain and vegetables. They did have centers of trade and commerce, and they did have trade routes that went through their cities. So they were pretty advanced people, but also very barbaric in their practice of religion. We don't really know a lot about the Girgashites, and so I'm basically going to skip over them because I did look for information, and I was told over and over and over again that we don't know anything about them. So I will trust the experts on that. The Hivites are also known as the Gibeonites, and in the Bible they are the tribe that came down and tricked the Israelites into making a treaty with them. They are remembered in history for being a very unwarlike people, and so that may have been one way that they avoided war, was to make treaties and sometimes trick people into making treaties with them. Remember that they presented themselves to the Israelites as ambassadors from a distant, powerful country, and without even consulting God, Joshua went ahead and entered into a covenant or a treaty with the Gibeonites or the Hivites. Joshua didn't realize until afterward that he had been deceived, but he went ahead and he kept that covenant because he had entered it. This past week you also read the Baal cycle, and I'm not going to go back and read through it because you already read it for your homework this past week, but there are a few things that I would like to point out from the Baal cycle. First of all, I'd like to point out that just like the poetry that we read from Mesopotamia, that Canaanite literature or Canaanite poetry is characterized by a lot of the same things that we saw in Mesopotamian poetry. For example, hurry, let a house be built. Hurry, let a palace be erected. Hurry, let a house be built. Hurry, let a palace be erected. And so we see there repetition and reflection. Here we read, I shall surely put a window in the house, a casement in the midst of the palace. And I just wanted to point that out to you because we live in a time period where windows are everywhere. We never even think about not having a window in an office building or a house. They're just everywhere. They're commonplace. But when this was written, a window would have been something very special. Windows are actually difficult to incorporate into a structure, and so only a structure belonging to a king or a prince would have even had windows at this time. And so the fact that Kothar declares, "Oh, hear, O Baal. Know, O rider of the clouds, I will surely put a window in the house, a casement in the midst of the palace." He is honoring Baal in a very profound way that as a modern reader we might not even pick up on. And again, we have repetition. In addition to repetition, we also have examples of parallelism in the Baal cycle. Of cedars his house is to be built, of bricks his palace to be erected. Silver turns from blocks, gold is turned from bricks. My house have I built of silver, my palace of gold have I made. He caused the sheep gods to drink wine. He caused the ewe goddesses to drink wine. They drink wine from a goblet, from a cup of gold, the blood of the vines. From looking at the Baal cycle, we're going to go on and talk about poetry that we find in the Bible. There are 5 poetical books found in the Bible, and 4 of those books were written during the time that Israel was a kingdom. The first poetical book, the book of Job, most scholars think was written around the same time that the events in the book of Genesis took place. The book of Psalms was written during the life of King David, and the book of Proverbs was written during the lifetime of Solomon, as was Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. There are 3 major types of Hebrew poetry, and we're going to define them real quick. So if you'll turn to this page in your homework, and we'll get these definitions written down. Lyric poetry is poetry that is supposed to be accompanied by music, like a song. Instructional poetry is meant to teach principles of living through brief, forceful, and meaningful expression. And dramatic poetry is a narrative that tells a story in poetic form. The book of Psalms actually means the book of praises, and it contains a lot of examples of lyric poetry. This collection of 150 psalms has been used as a book of prayer and praise in public worship in the tabernacle, in the temple, and in the synagogues. There are 3 primary types of psalms: psalms of praise, psalms of thanksgiving, and psalms of lament or sorrow. King David wrote almost half of the psalms, while several different authors completed the rest. And so this week we're going to read some of the psalms. In addition, we're going to read some proverbs. The purpose of proverbs is to impart wisdom. It is instructional poetry, and it's written in short, meaningful maxims or sayings that are widely accepted on their own merits. They focus on one's relationship to God and to others. The message is that a life of wisdom and righteousness should prevent a life of foolishness and unrighteousness. Solomon is believed to be the author of the book of Proverbs, as well as the book of Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon. The book of Ecclesiastes, like the book of Proverbs, is a book of instructional poetry. Solomon, with his unlimited resources and opportunity, tries to find meaning in life through work, pleasure, wealth, wisdom, and power, and he finds it all unsatisfying. After he reviews these efforts, he concludes that the only thing that can satisfy a man is to fear God and to keep his commandments. If you'll go ahead and turn the page, we'll fill in some of your other pre-reading activities. Similar to Mesopotamian poetry, Hebrew poets used parallelism. Rather than matching sounds with rhymes like we do today, a Hebrew poet was concerned with matching ideas. This technique is called parallelism, and we've already learned about this. Note that this is different than the parallelism that we saw in Mesopotamian poetry. Each of the examples below show the kind of parallelism or matching of ideas that are common in Hebrew poetry. And so in the time that we have left, we're going to look up some of these and see if we can fill some of it in. So the first place we're supposed to look is in Psalm 1:6. And Psalm 1:6 says this: "For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. And so let's go ahead and fill that in. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. And so notice that there's a parallelism there between the way of the righteous and the way of the ungodly. Next, we're going to look at Psalm 25:4. Psalm 25:4 says, Show me your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Go ahead and get that filled in. Show me your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. And so notice that ways and paths are a parallel way of asking God to teach me. Psalm 23:1 says, The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So let's go ahead and write that in. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And finally, Psalm 42:1 says, As the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God. And we'll get that filled in. As the deer pants for water brooks, so pants my soul for you, O God. In addition to parallelism, Hebrew poets also used figures of speech. Hebrew poets used vivid imagery to create pictures in the reader's mind. The 5 most common figures of speech found in Hebrew poetry are similes, metaphors, hyperbole, rhetorical questions, and it's not on this page, but it's on your homework sheet, personification. Looking at Psalm 17, we're going to scroll down to verse 8. And Psalm 17, verse 8 says, Keep me as the apple of your eye, hide me under the shadow of your wings. And we'll go ahead and write that in. Remember that a simile is a comparison between 2 unlike things. And so what's being compared here is person who's writing to the eyeball of somebody, that the eyeball would have been the most important part of the body and the part that you want to take the best and most care of. And so the writer of Psalm 17 was saying, God, treat me as the apple of your eye. Protect me as a man would protect his eyeball, in other words, which is kind of a gross simile, but you understand. Next, we'll turn to Psalm 23. Psalm 23:1 says, The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So let's go ahead and get that filled in. The Lord is my shepherd. Remember that a metaphor is a comparison in which one thing is said to be another thing. And so we're not saying the Lord is like a shepherd. We're saying the Lord is a shepherd. And he's not just a shepherd. He's my shepherd. He's taking care of me. Next, we'll look at Psalm 6, verse 6. And Psalm 6, verse 6 says, I'm weary with my groaning. All night I make my bed swim. And so we'll go ahead and write that in. All night I make my bed swim. I drench my couch with my tears. Remember that hyperbole is a deliberate overstatement for the sake of emphasis. Are we really swimming in tears? Are we really drenching our couch with tears? No, we're not. But in order to make the figure of speech, in order to put a compelling idea into a person's mind, that's what we're saying. We're going to look next at Psalm 106. Psalm 106 verse 2 says, Who can utter the mighty acts of the Lord? Who can declare all his praise? And so this is a rhetorical question. Remember that a rhetorical question is asking a question for the purpose of making a statement. It says, list the rhetorical question. Who can utter the mighty acts of the Lord? Who can declare all his praise? The obvious answer is, we can. We can do that. Moving down to personification, we're going to be looking at Psalm 104. And we'll scoot down to verse 19. Psalm 104 verse 19 says, He appointed the moon for seasons. The sun knows it's going down. Personification is assigning the characteristics of a human to a lifeless object. And so we'll go ahead and get that written in. He appointed the moon for seasons. The sun knows it's going down. So the sun is an inanimate object. It's an important inanimate object, but it has no life in it. And we are assigning human characteristics to it by saying that it knows it's going down. We're going to stop there with our pre-reading activities this week. And as always, I hope that you enjoy your reading for this week. You're going to be reading through some Psalms and answering some questions about those. And as always, if you have any questions, you know that you can always email me.